I want to tell you about a student I know who studied 47 hours the week before her NCLEX. 47 hours. She reread her notes. She reviewed her textbook chapters. She highlighted. She made color-coded summaries. She went through a question bank but spent most of her time reading the rationales rather than actually drilling the questions. She arrived at the testing center as prepared by volume of hours as she had ever been for any exam in her life. She failed, not by a lot, not catastrophically, but she failed. And when she debriefed what had happened, she could not fully explain it. She knew the material. She had covered everything. She had the notes to prove it. But in the exam room, under pressure, she could not consistently access what she had spent 47 hours reviewing. So she took 3 weeks, restructured her entire study approach, studied a total of 18 hours over those 3 weeks using a specific method, and passed. The same content, significantly fewer hours, completely different outcome. What changed was not the information she studied. What changed was how she studied it. Specifically, when she returned to information after first learning it, and in what format she engaged with it on each return. She stopped rereading and started retrieving. She stopped studying in long blocks and started studying in distributed intervals. She built a system that worked with the neuroscience of how her brain consolidates memory, instead of against it. That system has a name. It is spaced repetition, and it is the single most evidence-supported study method in the cognitive psychology literature. More effective than rereading, more effective than highlighting, more effective than summarizing, more effective than any passive review strategy you have ever been told to use. And the reason most nursing students are not using it is not because they have not heard of it. It is because nobody has explained the mechanism behind why it works. And without the mechanism, it just sounds like another study tip. We do not do study tips here. We do mechanisms. Plato believed that learning is recollection, the mind returning to what it has already encountered and finding deeper understanding with each return. He called it anamnesis. He was right. He just did not have the neuroscience to explain why. We do. Welcome to Think Like a Provider. Let's get into it. I'm Jenna Way, nurse practitioner, clinical educator, and creator of Think Like a Provider, the clinical reasoning educational system that teaches nurses and nursing students to master body systems through pathophysiology and evidence-based frameworks. We don't memorize here. We understand. If you're new, every episode we break down the mechanisms behind clinical reasoning, neuroscience, and what it actually takes to perform at your best, so you walk away thinking and acting like the provider you are meant to be. And if you want to go deeper than a podcast can take you, we have clinical reasoning tools, ebooks, and a growing Facebook community where we break this down together. And if you are ready for the full Academy experience, the Think Like a Provider Academy waitlist is open now. All the links are in the show notes. The greatest clinicians in history reasoned their way to the answer. So will you. Let's get into it. This is our neuroscience episode for the month. And I want to be clear about what we are actually doing here. This is not a study skills episode. This is not a list of tips. This is the neuroscience of memory consolidation applied to the specific demands of nursing education and board preparation. If you understand the mechanism, the strategy becomes obvious. If you don't, you are always guessing. Mechanism first, always. The forgetting curve, your brain's default setting. Let me introduce you to a German psychologist named Hermann Ebbinghaus. The year is 1885. Ebbinghaus, working entirely on himself as his own research subject, spends months memorizing lists of nonsense syllables, then testing his own recall at various time intervals to document exactly how quickly and in what pattern his memory of them decays. The result is what we now call the forgetting curve. And what it shows is genuinely disturbing if you have ever studied anything. Within 1 hour of learning new information, the average person has forgotten approximately 56% of it. Within 24 hours, that number climbs to 70%. Within a week, without any review, retention drops to roughly 10 to 20% of the original material. The forgetting curve is steep, it is fast, and it is, importantly, the brain's default state. Forgetting is not a failure of studying. It is the expected biological outcome of encoding information once and then not returning to it. The research on this has been replicated many times since Ebbinghaus. A 2022 review published in the Ear, Nose, and Throat Journal confirmed that the Ebbinghaus curve remains one of the most consistently replicated findings in cognitive psychology. Material encountered during a lecture or study session is lost rapidly over the ensuing days unless it is revisited at specific intervals. Now, here is the critical question. If the brain's default is to forget 70% of what it learns within 24 hours, what does that say about every study session you have ever had where you learned something once and moved on? It says that the majority of the content you studied the week before your last exam was gone before you sat down to take it. Not because you are a poor student, because you are a human with a brain that treats unreinforced information as noise to be cleared. And here is what makes this particularly devastating for nursing students. Unlike other academic disciplines where you learn a concept for an exam and then move on, clinical nursing requires durable long-term retention. The pathophysiology of sepsis you learn in your second semester needs to be accessible at the bedside in your fourth semester, your sixth semester, and your third year of practice. The medication mechanism you memorize for a pharmacology exam needs to be retrievable when you are standing at a medication administration record, asking yourself why this patient is on this drug. You cannot afford a 70% loss rate. And yet the study methods most nursing students use are designed for short-term performance on a single exam, not for the kind of durable, accessible memory that clinical practice demands. Spaced repetition was Ebbinghaus's solution to his own forgetting curve discovery. By revisiting studied content at carefully timed intervals, rather than in one long session, he found that the forgetting curve could be dramatically flattened, that each well-timed review encounter reset the decay trajectory, that with several strategically placed reviews, retention could approach near complete rather than near zero. The modern neuroscience explains exactly why. What your brain is actually doing when it forgets. Let me take you to the cellular level because the forgetting curve is not just a psychological observation. It is a description of what is happening in your neurons. Memory is stored in the brain as patterns of synaptic connections. When you learn something new, neurons that fire together in response to that information strengthen the synaptic connections between them, a process called long-term potentiation, or LTP. The principle underlying this is sometimes summarized as neurons that fire together wire together. The more times a particular pattern of neural activation occurs, the stronger the synaptic connections in that pattern become, and the more efficiently and reliably the pattern can be reactivated in the future. But here is the thing about LTP. It requires repetition to stabilize. The initial encoding of new information creates a weak temporary synaptic trace. If that trace is not reinforced, if the neural pattern is not reactivated, the synaptic connection weakens over time through a process called synaptic pruning. Your brain is constantly optimizing, eliminating connections that are not being used to free up resources for connections that are. Forgetting at the cellular level is synaptic pruning. Your brain is not failing when it forgets. It is making a judgment about which connections are worth maintaining based on how often they are being activated. Now, here is where spaced repetition enters the picture mechanistically. Every time you retrieve a piece of information, every time you actively pull it out of memory rather than passively rereading it, you reactivate the synaptic pattern associated with that information. That reactivation strengthens the LTP. It signals to the brain that this connection is being used and should be maintained. And each reactivation makes the subsequent reactivation faster and more reliable. This is the retrieval effect, and also called the testing effect. And it is one of the most robustly supported findings in learning science. Actively retrieving information from memory produces stronger, more durable long-term retention than passively rereading the same information multiple times. Not slightly stronger, substantially stronger. A 2024 randomized controlled trial published in BMC Medical Education, studying spaced learning in nurse anesthesia, students found that spaced learning produced significantly higher knowledge retention scores than conventional mass learning, with mean retention scores in the intervention group significantly exceeding those of the control group. And the effects persisted at follow-up assessment. This was not a marginal improvement. The spaced group retained dramatically more over a longer period with the same initial learning content. And this connects directly to something we covered in episode 12. Sleep is the biological mechanism by which your brain consolidates the memories formed during the day. The hippocampus replays the neural patterns of recently learned information during slow-wave sleep, transferring them to long-term cortical storage. Spaced repetition and sleep are biologically complementary. The review sessions you do during the day create the patterns the brain then consolidates during that night's sleep. Which means studying with spaced repetition and then sleeping adequately is not just two good habits that happen to coexist. They are synergistic biological interventions that compound each other's effect on memory consolidation. One more cellular mechanism worth understanding. Each retrieval attempt, especially a difficult one, where you have to work to recall the information, produces a stronger LTP effect than easy retrieval. The difficulty is the point. The generation effect in cognitive psychology shows that struggling to retrieve information, even partially, produces stronger long-term retention than reading the information passively. This is why passive review feels productive and is not. You are reading information your brain already has access to, which requires no retrieval effort and produces no additional LTP strengthening. Highlighting your notes is comfortable. It feels like studying, but your brain is barely working. There is no retrieval. There is no synaptic strengthening. There is just visual processing of information you already encoded once. The forgetting curve is running undisturbed in the background. Why rereading feels productive and isn't? This section exists because I know what most of you are doing when you study, and I need to name it directly. Rereading your notes feels productive because it is familiar. When you read something you have already seen, there is a sense of recognition, an experience of fluency that your brain interprets as understanding and retention. Psychologists call this the fluency illusion. The ease with which you recognize information when you reread it creates a false confidence that you will be able to retrieve it when you need it. But recognition and retrieval are not the same cognitive process. Recognition is passive. The information is in front of you, and your brain confirms it as something previously encountered. Retrieval is active. The information is not in front of you, and your brain must reconstruct it from the synaptic patterns stored in long-term memory. Exams test retrieval. Clinical practice tests retrieval, and rereading trains recognition. This is why students who reread extensively often arrive at an exam confident and then find that the information they feel certain they know is frustratingly inaccessible under test conditions. It is not anxiety causing the block, though anxiety doesn't help. It is the fact that they trained the wrong cognitive process. They trained recognition when they needed to build retrieval. A 2023 cohort study published in Medical Science Educator examining the impact of Anki, a spaced repetition flashcard application, on academic performance in medical students found that higher Anki usage was significantly associated with better academic performance. Students who used spaced repetition consistently outperformed those who relied on passive review methods, not because they studied more hours, because they trained retrieval instead of recognition. And a 2024 study published in BMC Medical Education, examining spaced repetition for clinical problem solving in undergraduate medical students, found that spaced repetition groups showed significantly better performance on clinical reasoning tasks, not just knowledge recall, but applied problem solving. Which means the benefits of spaced repetition are not limited to fact retention. They extend to the kind of mechanism-based pattern recognition that clinical reasoning requires. This is the bridge between this episode and everything else we do in this podcast. Every time you work through a clinical case, derive a differential from the mechanism or answer a practice question by reasoning rather than recognizing, you are doing spaced retrieval. You are reactivating synaptic patterns, strengthening them, and building the durable, accessible knowledge that shows up when a preceptor asks you a question you were not expecting. The optimal intervals. How to time your reviews. Here is the practical question. If spaced repetition is about reviewing material at timed intervals, what are the right intervals? The research on this is not perfectly precise. The optimal spacing depends on how long you need to retain the information, how complex the material is, and individual factors in learning rates. But the general principle is consistent across studies and is summarized by what researchers call expanding interval repetition. Here is how it works. You encounter new material for the first time. The first review should happen within 24 hours, ideally within the first few hours after initial learning, while the synaptic trace is still fresh but before significant decay has occurred. This first review dramatically flattens the initial steep portion of the forgetting curve. The second review happens within the next few days, typically 3 to 5 days after the initial learning. By this point, without review, you would have lost the majority of the content. The review reactivates the synaptic pattern and restarts the decay timer. The third review happens approximately 1 to 2 weeks later. Each successive review can be spaced further apart because each review strengthens the synaptic connection and slows the subsequent rate of decay. The pattern of expanding intervals, 24 hours, then days, then weeks, then months, matches the biological reality of how LTP stabilizes over time. A 2022 review in the Ear, Nose, and Throat Journal confirmed this schedule. One review within the first hour, another within 24 hours, then one within the first week, and one within the first month can produce near complete long-term retention of material that would otherwise be lost to the forgetting curve by the end of the first week. The practical implication for nursing students and NP board candidates is this. You do not need to reread a chapter 5 times in 1 week. You need to encounter the material once, review it actively within 24 hours, review it again within a few days, and then revisit it at expanding intervals over the following weeks. The same total time investment, spread differently, produces dramatically different retention outcomes. This is why studying for boards in the last 2 weeks before your exam is fundamentally the wrong approach. By the time you are in the last 2 weeks, the content you learned in the first month of your program is already deeply decayed. You are trying to re-encode information that could have been in durable long-term storage for months if it had been reviewed at appropriate intervals throughout your program. Spaced repetition is not a last-minute strategy. It is a throughout the program strategy, and the students who build it as a habit from the beginning of nursing school, not the beginning of boards preparation, are the ones who arrive at their NCLEX or their NP boards with a clinical knowledge foundation that is genuinely accessible under pressure. How to apply this in nursing and NP board prep. Let me make this immediately practical because mechanism without application is incomplete. The most accessible spaced repetition tool available right now is a flashcard system. Specifically, an active retrieval flashcard system like Anki, which uses an algorithm to schedule your card reviews based on your performance. When you get a card right easily, the algorithm increases the interval before showing it again. When you struggle with a card or get it wrong, the interval resets to a shorter window. This mimics the expanding interval principle automatically. But here is how you use flashcards correctly versus incorrectly. Correctly means you look at the question side of the card, you attempt to retrieve the answer from memory before flipping it, and you rate your own confidence honestly. Incorrectly means you flip the card immediately, read the answer, and tell yourself you knew it. That is recognition. That is not retrieval. And it produces none of the LTP strengthening that makes spaced repetition effective. The discomfort of not knowing, of struggling to retrieve, of partially getting it and feeling uncertain, that is the mechanism working. That difficulty is producing the synaptic strengthening. Do not short-circuit it by flipping the card early. For nursing school content specifically, pathophysiology is your highest value target for spaced repetition because it is the foundation that everything else in clinical practice builds on. If you have durable access to the mechanism of heart failure, what is happening in the myocardium, why the kidneys retain sodium and water, why the patient becomes dyspneic, then you do not need to separately memorize the symptoms, the medications, and the nursing interventions. You derive them from the mechanism. The mechanism is one card. The dependent knowledge it generates is everything else. For NP board prep, spaced retrieval through practice questions is your primary tool. Not reading rationales passively, answering the question first, committing to an answer, and then reading the rationale to understand why you were right or wrong. That sequence, attempt, commit, feedback, is a retrieval event. And a 2025 study published in Frontiers in Medicine implementing spaced repetition in undergraduate medical education confirmed that spaced retrieval practice with clinical problem-solving questions produced significantly better performance than traditional passive review methods. Schedule your review sessions deliberately. If you study cardiovascular pathophysiology on Monday, review it through active retrieval, not rereading, on Tuesday. Review it again on Thursday or Friday. Review it again the following week. By the time your boards arrive, that content has been through multiple spaced retrieval events and the synaptic pattern is strong, stable, and accessible even under the cortisol spike of an exam day. And integrate this with what we covered in episode 12. Your review sessions do their consolidation work during the sleep that follows them. A spaced retrieval session at 7 p.m. before a full night of sleep produces better long-term retention than the same session at 2 a.m. before 4 hours of disrupted sleep. The neuroscience of spaced repetition and the neuroscience of sleep are not separate topics. They are the same biological process viewed from two different angles. Plato believed that learning was recollection, the mind returning to what it has already encountered and finding something deeper each time. He was describing, without the vocabulary to name it, the mechanism of long-term potentiation. Each return to an idea strengthens the synaptic pattern that encodes it. Each retrieval event builds the neural architecture that makes that idea accessible under pressure. In the exam room, at the bedside, in the moment when a patient needs you to know something and know it now. Rereading is not recollection. Highlighting is not recollection. Passive review is not recollection. Retrieval is recollection. And spaced retrieval, timed, deliberate, distributed over days and weeks rather than crammed into hours, is the implementation of that principle at a biological level. You do not need more hours of studying. You need better structured hours. You need a system that works with the forgetting curve instead of pretending it does not exist. You need a system that strengthens synaptic connections through active retrieval instead of simply re-exposing you to information you have already encoded and then forgotten. For this week's homework, I want you to pick one topic you studied recently, one mechanism, one clinical concept, one pharmacology class, and instead of rereading it, I want you to close your notes and write down everything you can recall about it from memory. Not everything you could find if you opened the notes, everything you can retrieve right now without them. What you can retrieve is what you actually know. What you cannot retrieve is what the forgetting curve has already taken. And that gap between what you studied and what you can access is exactly the gap that spaced repetition is designed to close. Build the system, the brain will do the rest. Clinical reasoning tools, ebooks, and our Facebook community are in the show notes. The Think Like a Provider Academy waitlist is there too. When the Academy opens, mechanism-based learning and spaced retrieval are foundational to how every course inside it is structured. I will see you next week.